Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our keynote interview, Reaching Net Zero Through Technological Innovation. I'm Vijay Vaidiswaran, the Global Energy and Climate Innovation Editor of The Economist, and it's my great pleasure to welcome back to our stage Bill Gates, founder of Breakthrough Energy and co-chair of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Welcome, Bill.
Thank you.
This is an extraordinary moment for us to be having this conversation. As you argued in your book last year, there's a recognition of the need for innovative technologies to advance at an unprecedented rate if we're going to avert climate disaster. This means many aspects of society have to be reinvented, from legacy policies to business models. And it looks like we're at a moment when America, which had been a laggard on the global scene in terms of policy, has turned the corner. We've fairly recently had legislation in Washington, the most important climate bill perhaps in American history, pass. How do we capitalize on the political momentum to attract private capital and drive faster innovation? That's what I'm hoping you'll give us some insights. And maybe just to start on that point about accelerating innovation, what are your main ideas on how we do that?
If you take the short-term metrics on emissions reduction, the progress is disappointing. Even in the United States, we have coal plants that are going to be in use a lot longer, and the rate of installation of solar and wind is not, going up. In many cases, it's going down. Things like transmission, we still have a lot of work to make that regulatory process work well. But because of the long lead time innovation piece, I'm actually, feeling quite good about what happened this year. The small companies, many of them spin-offs from universities, that are looking at all the different areas of emissions, from cheap green hydrogen to direct air capture to steel, cement, to agriculture. They've really looked at completely new approaches where the extra cost, what I call the green premium, could be zero, or in some cases even negative. And particularly as you're trying to drive adoption in middle-income countries that account for the majority of all emissions, if you have a high green premium, either you're asking them to slow down development, or they're going to ask for hundreds of billions of subsidies that aren't likely, even though you could argue they're just and valuable, they're not likely to happen. And so innovation lets us, square that constraint. And what I'm seeing is a lot of great approaches. The recent legislation in the US, really three different bills: the infrastructure bill that came first, the so-called Competes or CHIP Act that came second, and then finally the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, that came third. All of them have very important climate elements, and particularly addressed towards taking these laboratory-based ideas and scaling them up. And, when you first made solar or lithium-ion batteries, the premium cost was very high, the green premium, but with some subsidization, the volume went up and the learning curve worked. And now, those are foundational technologies for the progress that we've made. And we have to see that with another, 10 or so technology areas. And so it's quite impressive that a year ago we thought, can we get zero of these three bills, one, two, or all three? And in fact, we got all three, and at least the climate provisions are largely what we'd hoped for. That is, the tax credits in this last bill, the project funding in the infrastructure bill, and a significant amount of new R&D funding in the Competes Act. So it's a trifecta that says to me that the U.S. innovation power and actually doing projects here that'll get those premiums down, this is going better than I expected.
Can you talk a little bit about the impact that the new legislation might have in getting good ideas out of the laboratories. For example, the Department of Energy laboratories that have often come up with great technologies, but there has been some criticism about getting those to the marketplace, about the translation, that they're getting through the valleys of death along the way to getting them into the hands of entrepreneurs that have the capital and ability to scale. Do you see anything in the legislation, or is that really something where the private sector has to step in and pick up the ball from there?
Well, philanthropy has stepped up with things like breakthrough energy fellowships, where if you're in the labs with an idea, even before it's venture fundable, we have grants that we make to give you a couple of years to try and uh, get it into a form where it can be funded. Then we also have breakthrough energy ventures that's taking ideas that look plausible and willing to take big risk, because all they do is invest in high impact climate companies. And at least in the funding environment we had up until recently, once something was endorsed by our technology review, we found that there was lots of co-funding, and so often we'd even be oversubscribed for these companies. Even things like Commonwealth Fusion, that was raising over $1 billion. So, really a positive environment. It is true that with the turn of the economic cycle, some of that early stage investing will be harder to get or be done at
Mm-hmm.
somewhat lower valuations. But we had anticipated that. That's not a surprise. In the uh, big innovation game, you have periods where it feels like summer, where there's a lot of money, even for the early stage stuff. And then there's periods that are kind of like winter, where even the stuff that pencils out pretty well may not get enough capital. And we're certainly, it's not full blown winter, but we have to be ready for that. And thank goodness a lot of these companies were well funded, for the next 2 or 3 years, so they can get up to that project level where infrastructure money or green money that is part of the European recovery plan, about 30% of the 800 billion are climate related projects. So it's not just the United States, but when you subsidize green hydrogen, you can take that very early stage and have a company that isn't burning through capital, because the tax credit covers that green premium amount. So the part of the bill that I felt was most important was the new technology piece. Yes, the electric car, solar and wind credits help accelerate the adoption there, but the funding for direct air capture, clean hydrogen, industrial processes, that's where,
Carbon
without that
capture,
money,
sequestration.
exactly.
Imagine CCUS
Yeah.
and so on. Right. And so, and that's the tension. Sometimes in the environmental movement, there has been a tension between deployment of existing clean technologies versus the innovation. I think Secretary Kerry got some criticism last year when he talked about the vital role of innovation to tackle climate change, because it has been posited as though it's one or the other. But I think we see with the legislation that both are going to get a boost, it sounds like.
Well, there's areas of emissions that we don't have any existing technology for. So the idea you can do this thing without innovation, are people just thinking about electricity and passenger cars? That's not even 25% of emissions. I mean, what are they
So are
thinking
you
about?
saying that windmills and Teslas can't solve all these environmental problems?
No, no. The cement emissions, the steel emissions, those are completely unaddressed by any existing technology. And if you do it brute force, which is take the current state of the art direct air capture as that offset, you increase, the cost of air travel and cement, dramatically.
Sure.
And so that's not realistic. So anybody, who thinks you can do this without innovation isn't looking at all the sources of emissions.
So, and I can assure you, our sophisticated economist viewers and readers will certainly appreciate that point. And to press on that a little bit, though, the sectors that are often called hard to abate, typically heavy industry, areas where maybe fossil fuels are used both for their chemical composition as well as for burning for energy content and so on, petrochemicals, et cetera, fertilizer making, high temperature applications. In those areas, now that there is some policy attention to it and you have a visibility on the technologies that are sort of bubbling up, what do you see as the two or three most promising areas? No pun intended, of course. Where should we be watching? Where do we need to do more to really get something promising to scale much faster than it might happen of its own volition?
The interest level in green hydrogen or clean hydrogen of any color is very high, and that's super valuable. We don't have anybody making that for even $2 a kilogram, not to mention the ideal cost, which would be to get all the way down to $1 a kilogram. It's like more like 4 or 5. But I'm seeing companies that can get that price way down. And the beauty of clean hydrogen is that in many cases where you've been using natural gas, like to make fertilizer, or in the steel making process where you're actually using a form of coal, the coke input there, clean hydrogen at a low enough price lets you redesign the industrial process. So that's your key input, not coke or the natural gas. So if you take that industrial wedge, over half of the problems in there, if you get the hydrogen to be cheap enough, which we shouldn't take for granted, it solves that piece. Some of the others, you can go to direct electrification. So there are innovators in the steel world who say, no, let's just use electricity to do the reduction. There's people who say, no, let's use green hydrogen. And there'll be projects that try either approach, and the economics will eventually probably favor one or the other, but it's great that we have both of those. Another area that is important is we're really starting to look at what does this grid, this green grid, look like, and particularly the challenge of grid reliability during the tough periods, which are heat waves and cold snaps. In your cold period, the wind is stagnant, it's cloudy. So sadly, you have this huge correlation between one of your two periods of greatest demand, that is when it's very cold, particularly say in northern US, northern Europe, and when your generation is going to be unusually low from the key renewable sources. So thinking about what does the heat wave look like, again, often low wind at that time, and yet peak demand. And there, the further south you go, those heating loads, particularly as you get more air conditioning, which sadly is a necessary response to the higher temperatures, it gets very, very difficult. So the sophistication of what will the grid look like? How much transmission, storage, will there be fusion or fission? And this is a case where each country needs to have a plan. Is it willing to depend on other countries? So you're thinking of a multi-country grid, which fortunately the EU can do this a lot more easily by doing it on a regional basis. Even North America, by pulling in Canada and Mexico, it gets easier to solve a very, very tough challenge. But then you look to, say, Japan or Singapore, would they be willing to be dependent? That's, a very important question that you have to look at country by country.
You mentioned, I'm glad you brought up countries in Asia and elsewhere, as we've focused a lot on the US. But if we look at the potential for leapfrogging in other parts of the world, when you survey the scene, where do you see, particularly in developing countries, do you see some with either natural endowments or certain frugal engineering capabilities, or the lack of legacy, as with mobile telephony, leapfrogging where there weren't landlines? Is there some analogy to be made here where we might see a surprise coming out of India or Africa on clean energy?
Well, it's a lot of the clean energy uh, cost reduction has been done in China, for the lithium ion batteries and the solar panels. It's been great to see that India, a number of uh, the government and some of the private sector people, including Reliance under Mukesh Ambani, is bringing their skill and saying, okay, we can, even do better than China's done on this. So engaging them in low cost manufacturing, not only for their domestic use, but contributing to the global availability of these tools. That was great to see. There are countries that have unique resources. Australia in their desert,
Mm-hmm.
has a lot of solar capacity, and so the Sun Cable effort that's attempting to actually transmit through undersea cables up to other countries, including Singapore. I hope that manages to be successful. There are countries like Colombia that have massive offshore wind, and even though they're not near to where you'd use that, if you can make hydrogen or methanol or ammonia and get the transport costs to be low enough, then you can take advantage of some of those unique resources. So yes, the places you have geothermal, you should, go and do as best you can. The unique solar resources we should go after. I'm not, at this point, we still uh, don't have a plan for what those grids look like. Even in the US, the nominal
Mm-hmm.
goal of getting to a green grid by 2035, that's not currently realistic. We need to map aspiration into plans, including the permitting challenges, even that go even beyond the pure economic challenge.
Now, Bill, the idea of international trade in hydrogen or other green derivative fuels raises a question in my mind. That is that we're living through an age with, generally speaking, economic nationalism on the rise. We've seen this not even related to clean energy, more generally, and now being applied specifically to either made in America or made in India type policies. We see tariffs going up against Chinese products, also some supply chain concerns raised about security of supply. When you think about the need for technological innovation, for accelerating the pace of these climate tech innovations that we're talking about, how does this trend, if indeed you accept my argument, how does that affect your thinking? Is this something that could slow down this global innovation revolution, or do you think that maybe there is a way to make that compatible with the pace of change that we need to see?
It's one of the headwinds we face in trying to find the best approaches anywhere in the world and get broad adoption. Uh, will, as US companies come up with good climate related technologies, will the state of the US China relations in an area where it's a clear win win, will it allow the right type of cooperation to take place? That it's not guaranteed that that'll proceed as well as it should. The energy markets, put aside climate, are the biggest part of global trade that there is. And so,
Mm,
uh, right now, Europe wishes it wasn't so dependent on Russian natural gas, and it
right.
will build, against that supply chain, a higher degree of resilience going into the future. So the threat of future withdrawals aren't nearly uh, as painful as what Europe's having to face right now. So, yeah, the energy markets have been highly dependent on world trade. Actually, the climate related technologies often brings your generation away from faraway coal, natural gas, or gasoline, and whether it's nuclear or solar or wind, it's more nearby. How much hydrogen will move uh, is really um, a a transportation challenge. If you're a country who's importing your hydrogen, then if you have industrial processes that use hydrogen, why shouldn't those industrial processes move to the country that the hydrogen comes from? Because they don't bear that transport cost, so they're essentially cost advantaged, whether it's making chemicals or steel. So I think a lot of countries will do their best to have hydrogen where you don't bear that transport cost. That if they can come up with enough renewable electricity in an economic process, they'll do domestic generation. But that's one of those very dynamic things that has to play out. But in a sense, less energy will move across borders because the hydrocarbons massively are international trade today.
Right. So it may localize, but for reasons other than protectionism, as you point out, it might make more sense to do it.
Exactly.
As we look ahead to the UN summit, COP27, as it's known in Egypt, what do you see as the main topic there, or what would you like to see as the main topic there?
Well, I'm super glad that Egypt's stepping up, because the countries that are closer to the equator actually suffer the most damage. And so the fact that it's not just a temperate zone rich country thing, that they're hosting this thing and they can talk about their challenges. They also have legitimacy to make the adaptation agenda get higher visibility, including things like, what about farmers in all parts of Africa, not just Egypt, but the Sahel and places where the food crisis and fertilizer prices are already showing us that having Africa be such a gigantic net importer of food is leading to more malnutrition, even in some locations, renewed starvation. So I was a little worried that, the amount of new things that can happen in a year is not gigantic. Every 5 years, okay, some big breakthroughs take place. And, it used to be the COPs, every fifth was kind of the big one. Here, climate is more on the agenda, which I'm super glad about. But I do worry that the activists will say, hey, what have you done since Glasgow? And sadly, because of the war in Ukraine, in many cases, the delay on coal retirement or other emitting type processes, is going to fall short of what we'd hope for in Scotland, when we didn't weight the chance of a war like this very highly. So it'll be an important conference, but I'm afraid people won't see a year's progress in a year on many of the near-term goals.
Now, Bill, as you know, we have a large Middle Eastern and in-person audience as part of this event. We recognize that the UAE and the Middle East region has set some significant net zero targets, but also as big energy producers, what role do you think that region needs to play in the rapid decarbonization of energy?
Well, the Middle East, certainly the oil producers who are, experiencing record prices. I hope that for their fellow region members, they can help with not just the short-term food issues, but also helping Africa become self-sufficient in food. It's really an imperative that that take place. The UAE is, very forward-looking, and setting a good example of aggressive goals. They built some nuclear reactors that are just coming into service, and did that in a very thoughtful way and managed those projects quite professionally. It is a paradox for those countries that unless we can figure out a super totally clean way to extract hydrogen from their resources, primarily their natural gas, that the potential revenues as we achieve our goals here could go down quite a bit. And so to have them investing in new approaches, looking at the hydrogen pathway, so-called methane pyrolysis type hydrogen. It's great to have them involved, and the fact that the COP after this one will be hosted by the UAE.
Right, absolutely. That's part of the arc of going from Egypt to UAE. If we take a larger frame, going beyond that, what would your vision be for 2050 for an age of transformation in the Middle East, which has supplied the last century with a lot of its energy, but maybe some of the countries will be the last man standing, as it were, with these vast hydrocarbon resources, but also have the potential to do CCS or green hydrogen or blue hydrogen, a variety of things that other countries may not have the resources to. What would you like to see as that vision for 2050?
Well, certainly the world at large underinvests in R&D on these issues. Fusion gets some R&D, and now you have some private sector money coming into that. In the long run, that will be a critical technology. Very hard to predict when, so we don't want to rely on it. But surprising amount of progress in that area. Nuclear fission, a new generation of reactors that are inherently safe and whose economics are significantly better than what we've had to date with fairly complex designs. I think the Middle East can be one of many regions that looks at that and is a participant. Clean hydrogen, I'd be super disappointed if a lot of that wasn't coming out of the Middle East and maintaining some of the value of particularly the natural gas assets that they have. If solar export, really can be made so that other countries are willing to rely on it, certainly the transmission losses are low enough that if you're not worried about the security piece, then it can be not just Saudi Arabia, but that whole North African belt. There's quite good solar there. That things like that Sun Cable Australian project I mentioned, in an analogous way, do you cable across the Mediterranean and have some way that you feel comfortable with that security and political risk that's involved there. I mean, Europe is going to think twice before they make their energy markets dependent on outsiders in some dramatic way. But the Middle East is definitely part of the solution. They're lucky that many of the countries can accumulate enough wealth that, given modest population sizes, certainly, in Qatar, UAE, they can provide for their future. Saudi Arabia needs to be a player in industrial output, because they're not going to, even though they have this incredible level of profitability on a per capita basis, they won't be able to accumulate similar resources. So they, in the end, it's always your human capital that decides how well off you are. Everything else is a bit ephemeral besides human capital.
If you were to give one final burst of inspiration to our audience on how to accelerate innovation in this vital area, what would it be, Bill, just in closing?
Well, I'd encourage people to help actually get projects built. At the lab level, we can make green steel. At the lab level, we can make green cement. And many of those things, as they try to scale up, will not succeed. But the expertise of kind of the pure science person in the lab versus the practical minded person who's built, previous cement plants, we're talking about bringing that together, whether it's within the United States or in Europe, or, connecting with the big steel and cement producers in China. Now's the time that, because that seed of innovation is there, that in the next decade, a lot of it's going to be those scale up projects. And I think a number will succeed. The other thing I'd just highlight is that adaptation is super necessary. The farmers near the equator deserve dramatically better seeds and better credit and better advice so that they don't become the first victims of climate change. And already we're seeing those agricultural outputs are getting worse faster than we would have anticipated. So adaptation, the innovation agenda there is equally important.
It's great. Powerful words to close on. Bill Gates, thank you very much.
Thank you.